Welcome to the Kino Corner. This is the beginner's guide to Robert Bresson.
Silencieux, ennuyeux, qui nous fait un peu peur. Mais notre amour est pur et innocent.
Contrôler la précision, être moi-même un instrument de précision. If you studied cinematic history, the name Robert Bresson might ring a bell. Maybe you heard that Paul Schrader wrote about him in his book on transcendental cinema. Perhaps you had to watch O Hazard Balthazar for your French cinema class. At any rate, Bresson may be one of the least well-known cinematic masters. He's definitely well-known among the well-read, or perhaps the right word is well-watched, or cineasts. But ask anyone outside of this niche group who Robert Bresson is, and I guarantee you they won't have a clue. But just because he isn't as conventionally popular as someone like Steven Spielberg doesn't mean that his body of work isn't incredibly influential. He influenced directors like Richard Linklater, Michael Haneke, Paul Schrader, Chantal Akerman, the Safdie brothers, and Andrei Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky even said that he considered Bresson one of the few geniuses in cinema to exist. Imagine that. Andrei Tarkovsky, hailed as the master of cinema by many, looked up to Robert Bresson. Partially, that's why it was amazing that they both won awards at the Cannes Film Festival in 1983, with Orson Welles presenting the awards. Every time I see the photos of them on stage together, I'm in awe of how much cinematic talent is concentrated on one stage. But I need to warn you, just because almost every serious filmmaker reveres Bresson doesn't mean that his films are easily accessible and, even less so, easily likable. No, they're opaque, elliptical, sparse, minimalistic, dark, and often frustrating. Bresson had no peers. He hardly went to the cinema and often looked down upon any movies he did happen to see. His life goal was simple: to create a new language of cinema, or cinematography as he called it. He wanted to separate cinematography from every art that preceded it, including theater, literature, and painting. His tunnel vision within this philosophy produced many of the best and most important films ever to exist within this art form. Not much is known about Bresson's early life, but I'll convey a bit of what is known to give some context for his films. Bresson was born on the 25th of September, 1901 in Beaumont-le-Motte, Puy-de-Dôme, France, to Marie-Elisabeth and Léon Bresson. After graduating school, Bresson pursued a career in painting in Paris. However, he left painting, citing that Cézanne had pushed painting to its edge. He felt that there was nothing more to explore within the medium, so he instead turned to film, which was an incredibly young art form at the time, and still is, relatively speaking. He directed his first film, a slapstick short film called Les Affaires Publiques in 1934. World War II would disrupt his film career and revitalize it at the same time. During the war, Bresson spent over a year in a German prisoner of war camp. It was during his stay in the camp that he conceived the idea for his first feature film, Les Anges du Péché. It is in my opinion, too, that his time as a prisoner helped shape his personal style. After the war, Bresson directed 13 feature-length films over the course of 40 years, from 1943 to 1983. I want to especially note that he started directing films in the 40s because there is a common misconception among people not super familiar with his work that he was one of the directors of the Nouvelle Vague. This is categorically false. He influenced the directors of the Nouvelle Vague, with Truffaut, Malle, and Godard idolizing him, and so it's understandable why some may confuse his style with theirs. If anything, they were borrowing from him and not vice versa. It's more accurate to say that French directors Jean Cocteau and Jean Renoir were his peers. It would make sense since Bresson worked with Cocteau, but as I said earlier in this video, Bresson was peerless. He wasn't a part of any movement. He rejected cinematic influences. He was a singular voice. He was in a category of his own. Bresson, in his adult life, lived on the Ile Saint-Louis in the heart of Paris. He lived a long life, dying at the age of 98 on the 18th of December, 1999. He never made much money from his films, as most of them had incredibly small budgets and little to no mass appeal. But nevertheless, his films have endured the harshest critic of all: time. Before we can truly dive into his films, we have to address his philosophy of cinematography. It's not enough to call how his films look and feel his style, as his directorial decisions stem from a precise and rigid system he created for himself. Of course, in this video, I won't be able to cover absolutely everything regarding his philosophy, but if you want to explore it further, I highly recommend his book Notes on the Cinematograph, which is his collection of thoughts as well as his cinematic philosophy. If you want to dive even deeper, read Bresson on Bresson, which is a culmination of many of his interviews over the course of his entire career. So let's ask ourselves a question. Why would Bresson, or anyone for that matter, impose a harsh set of rules that restrict his filmmaking? Well, the answer is simple. Art flourishes under restriction. Paintings are restricted by the size of their canvases, and films are restricted by budgets, rules, and time. To approach his philosophy, I'm going to read a few excerpts from his notes on the cinematograph before outlining his philosophy in clearer terms. Models. Capable of eluding their own vigilance. Capable of being divinely themselves. To your models, speak as if you were speaking to yourselves. Monologue instead of dialogue. To move people not with images likely to move us, but with relations of images that render them both alive and moving. The omnipotence of rhythms. Nothing is durable but what is caught up in rhythms. Bend content to form and sense to rhythms. Model. Preserved from any obligation towards the art of drama. Nothing more inelegant and ineffective than an art conceived in another art's form. No psychology, of the king which discovers only what it can explain. In this language of images, one must lose completely the notion of image. The images must exclude the idea of image. The real is not dramatic. Drama will be born of a certain march of non-dramatic elements. Dig into your sensation. Look at what is there within. Don't analyze it with words. Translate it into sister images, into equivalent sounds. The clearer it is, the more your style affirms itself. Style, all that is not technique. So what does this all mean? Is it rambling? Well, no. His philosophy is quite precise, even if there might not be a one-page summary of it all. Hopefully, this video can serve as that summary. So in the most basic terms, here are his rules and his philosophy. He never used professional actors after Les Dames du Bois de Boulogne. Instead, he casted what he called models, which were non-professional actors whom Bresson felt best resembled the character. Early in his career, he looked for people with a moral resemblance. But later in his career, he admitted that casting was based more on their vocal intonations and his own intuition. His models must deliver their lines in the flattest way possible, speaking as if they are speaking to themselves. They must not consciously emote with their faces so that they don't perform. He had his actors move automatically, not thinking about their movements. Many of the shots focused on hands, as he believed that hands move on their own, without our thinking. He always used a 50mm lens. He said that changing lenses was like changing eyeglasses. He shot every image to be flat. He didn't want one image to stand out in this film, a problem he labeled as postcardism. This is why he resisted switching to color film for many years. He would only use music in his films if it transformed the image. This is why his films featured little to no music, and usually did not contain a score, save for his earlier movies. There are many cases of diegetic music in his films, music played from an on-screen source, but far fewer cases of non-diegetic music, which is music that does not originate in the film's world. Sound design was not made to match realistic expectations of the scenes. Often he used sound to isolate his subjects. He would also use sound to create mental images of what was happening off-screen, such as when we hear a car crash in O Hazard Balthazar. In fact, he believed sound to be more important than visuals. To use an example that he illustrated, imagine the sound of a train coming into a station. When you hear the sound, so many images come to mind. You imagine the train, the station, and all the people in it. One sound can evoke all of that. So if Bresson could express something aurally, rather than visually, he would. He cut his films to maintain a rhythm more than anything else. Often he used ellipses in his films. Ellipses, in the case of editing, is when a section of the film is cut out by editing, leaving it to the viewer to fill in the gaps. Let's take a look at this example in L'Argent. Here we see the dog running into the room, with the family alive on the stairs. When we move back to the stairs, the family is dead. We know exactly what has happened without needing to see it. The seamless edit is a great use of ellipsis. He rejected symbols and psychology in his work. He wanted his images to just be images. He tried to make all of his films contemporary, or at least he rejected historical imagery. For example, the clothes in the Trial of Joan of Arc were contemporary. Of course, this wasn't the case with Lancelot of the Lake. There is a single philosophical idea that binds all of these rules together. The philosophy is that film, as an art form, is defined by its relations, not by its individual parts. Acting and drama come from the theater. Cinematography, not in Bresson's sense of the word, but the common definition, comes from photography. Music is its own art form. What makes a film is the sum of its parts, not the parts themselves, so the individual parts should not be distinguishable from each other. The images are flat. The actors are flat. The sound is minimalistic. His method creates films that are consistent and are meant to be appreciated as a whole. Much like you don't examine every brushstroke of a painting, you don't examine every aspect of a film. What the method allows is for an emotional resonance in any slight deviation. It forces the audience to think and to recognize nuances in the actor's eyes and gestures. And when there is emotion, we remember it vividly. This method allowed Bresson to create a new form of cinema, rather than reproducing old art forms, since reproduction is not art. He did not want the camera to merely capture something theatrical. He despised film theater. The intention was to use the camera not as a tool of reproduction, but as a tool of creation. He would create on set, allowing his models to excite him with gestures and glances that he himself could not predict. Everything he shot, he would manipulate in the editing room to a specific rhythm, and it's this rhythm that binds all of the disparate parts together in complete, compelling films. But, like any artist, he wasn't always faithful to, or even fully knew, his own philosophy. Rather, as he grew older and more experienced, he developed his outlook and changed with the times when he could intellectually justify it, such as when he transitioned to shooting on color film stock. As a result, his films grew more and more opaque and cutting edge as he aged. Some other stylistic choices of his that I haven't covered but I will before I discuss his individual films are as follows. He had a penchant for including animals in his films, whether it was the donkey in O Hazard Balthazar or the dog and pigeons in The Trial of Joan of Arc. Shots of doors appear in his films quite frequently, both closed and open, and often carry dramatic or emotional significance with them. In addition to actors delivering their lines dryly, their lines would often be written in a direct manner. Don't expect flowery language in his films. Lastly, Bresson was a devout Christian. Christian themes and imagery permeate many of his movies, from the tale of Nicodemus and A Man Escaped, to the religious questioning in The Trial of Joan of Arc. I want everyone to watch his films, so I'm not going to do an in-depth analysis about each film on this video. Maybe later I'll look at each film individually. Bresson's first film, Public Affairs, was a short slapstick comedy of all things. The film was marred by Bresson and the studio not cooperating, with the studio cutting much of the footage in post and changing the film's title without Bresson's knowledge or permission before release. The film flopped, and so Bresson had to work elsewhere in film, often working as a screenwriter or script editor for the 9 years following Public Affairs' release. Les Anges du Péché is technically his first feature film, a film which he was inspired to make while in a German prison. It's also the least Bressonian work of his. It stars professional actors, and the story about ex-convict nuns is quite melodramatic for Bresson. Nevertheless, the seed of his style is in this film. There are ellipses, close-ups, and the use of a prison setting. Bresson claimed that he formed much of his style during the shoot for this film. He tried to get the actresses to perform, or not perform, as he wanted, but it went against everything they wanted to do so much that they cried. He decided that he didn't really like working with professional actors while on this set. But he worked with professional actors in his next film. Why? Because most investors are uneasy about funding a movie where the director doesn't cast a single professional actor. Les Dames du Bois de Boulogne is perhaps his most commercial film. Written by Jean Cocteau, the film is a twisty-turny romance revenge about a woman making her ex-husband fall in love with a girl she knows to be loose. A dancing woman, one might say. Her scheming, and thus the inherent structure of the film, elevates the film above most other romance movies and makes for a fun viewing experience. This was truly the last movie where Bresson would work with professional actors. For this reason, he couldn't get another movie made for 5 years. And 5 years later, he released Diary of a Country Priest, a film many considered to be a masterpiece. Adapted from the Georges Bernanos novel of the same name, the film follows a young, ailing priest persecuted by the community he's serving. Most of the talking in the film is in the form of the priest's internal monologue, and the diary entries serve as the main structure of the movie. Bresson himself stated that what convinced him to make the movie was the idea of making the movie with the diary entries setting the rhythm and pace. The film won the grand prize at the Venice International Film Festival, as well as the Prix Louis Deluc. I consider this film to be a sort of midway point for Bresson's cinema. It's the first film of his to use entirely non-professional actors, but it still contains holdovers from his works on studio projects, such as the use of a score. A Man Escaped, or known in French as Un quand nommé à mort s'est échappé ou le vent souffle où il veut, the film is based on the memoirs of André Devigny, but heavily changed. The film follows Fontaine, a French resistance fighter imprisoned by the Germans in Lyon. No doubt, also inspired by his time as POW, Bresson takes a decidedly methodical approach, rejecting any kind of conventional drama. Much of the tension centers around doors, whether they're open or closed, whether other inmates are using their doors to communicate, and whether or not the guards can notice the changes Fontaine is making to his door. Most of the film takes place within his cell, with his inner monologue, again, comprising most of the speaking within the film. As in The Diary of a Country Priest, the inner monologue is used not only to highlight things that we can't see, but it's also sometimes used to contradict what's on screen. The anti-melodramatic methodical approach, highlighting Fontaine's extreme resourcefulness and creating tension from mere footstep sounds, helps make A Man Escaped an unexpected, nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat thriller. Godard once said that Robert Bresson is French cinema, as Dostoevsky is the Russian novel and Mozart is German music. It's fitting then that in Pickpocket, we see Bresson essentially adapt Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, although he denied that he ever meant it to be an adaptation. The story is simple. Michel, a young man with a dying mother, finds a thrill in pickpocketing and so joins a small gang of pickpockets in Paris. While he's stealing wallets, a detective tries to gather enough evidence to arrest him while Jean, the girlfriend of Jacques, Michel's brother, falls in love with Michel. The movie was filmed on the streets of Paris and in real locations, including the always busy Gare de Lyon, which has caused many people to wrongly think the film is in the French New Wave. The most interesting fact about this film, to me at least, is that Bresson hired real pickpockets for the movie in order to achieve a greater sense of realism. The methods that they use in the film are real methods, so real in fact that the realistic pickpocketing techniques got the film banned in Finland until 1965. It's not fair to call The Trial of Joan of Arc a period piece, although Bresson adapted the script from the actual minutes of the trial, using what was actually said in the trial in the film. However, for brevity's sake, he condensed what would have been about 10 hours worth of courtroom talking into about an hour of film. The dialogue may have been realistic, but Bresson made sure that Joan felt modern. The clothes aren't period accurate and are at times explicitly modern. Bresson stays away from showing the peasants, and when he does, focuses on their feet. The film is thus an amalgamation of the old and the new, presenting Joan as a universal figure who is as relevant now as she was back then. Upon its release, it garnered critical praise, but critics thought that Bresson betrayed his own values and philosophy with the ending of the film, where doves fly above Joan. Bresson denied the claims that this shot was symbolic of anything, and said that at public events, it's common to see pigeons fly. Regarded as his all-time masterpiece, critical press at the time branded O Hazard Balthazar as a new kind of cinema. Inspired in part by Dostoevsky's The Idiot, the film concerns a donkey, Balthazar, who moves from owner to owner. The different episodes are thought to represent the 7 deadly sins, with Balthazar enduring endless abuse in a Christ-like way. Bresson believed donkeys to be smarter than people thought, and no doubt the Christian significance of the donkey played a role in Bresson choosing that specific animal to lead the film. Bresson also cast an untrained donkey, thinking that an audience could tell if a donkey was trained. This reportedly caused production issues. Nevertheless, O Hazard Balthazar is not only considered Bresson's finest work, but it currently is considered the 16th greatest film of all time by Sight and Sound. Made just after O Hazard Balthazar, Mouchette acts as a sort of companion piece. Bernanos's estate wanted Bresson to adapt his novel Mouchette into a film, and Bresson complied, as he had written the script earlier, and so could waste no time in getting back to set. Mouchette is another tale of abuse. The titular character faces abuse from the town residents, as well as her own alcoholic father. Not to mention, her mother is an invalid for whom she must care for. As the film progresses, the injustices and offenses compound, leading to an incredibly tragic finale. Something interesting to note about the film is the use of music, Monteverdi's Magnificat, used in the first and last scenes, encapsulating the film in Christianity, highlighting the fact that Bresson was not anti-music in film, but just believed music should only be used to transform the film. A Gentlewoman, or Une Femme Douce, was Bresson's first foray into color film. He had resisted the shift to color photography for many years, but with A Gentlewoman, he relented. The film operates as a series of flashbacks, as a grieving husband tries to understand why his wife committed suicide. Adapted from the Dostoevsky short story, A Gentle Creature, Korotkaya, Bresson also modernizes an old story, setting the film in modern-day Paris. The film, on the surface, is about the dissolution of a marriage, but it's also a meditation on cinema's placement in the world of art. The characters in the film watch a film at the cinema, they visit art museums, and they watch a performance of Hamlet in the theater. The film maintains the aesthetic Bressonian style, but the way it peers into the other arts brings not only the film's style to the foreground, but also the style, quirks, and emotions of other forms to the foreground as well. In a sense, Bresson illustrates how his pure cinematography is different from anything else. Move over, Dostoevsky, because Bresson is now adapting Tolstoy. Four Nights of a Dreamer is Tolstoy's short story White Nights, set in a modern Paris, with Pont-Neuf serving as the primary location. Jacques, a painter, finds a woman, Marthe, preparing to jump off the bridge. He talks her off the ledge, and they agree to meet each other at the same spot the next night. Like the title suggests, the film takes place over the course of 4 nights. Over these 4 nights, Jacques learns about her past and what led her to attempting suicide, while falling in love with her at the same time. This film is particularly interesting in how Bresson uses live music, no doubt because live music is natural to Pont-Neuf. Bresson actually lived in a house overlooking Pont-Neuf, which is probably a reason why this film, made by a then 70-year-old man about the Parisian youth, feels so genuine. Bresson's only film to explicitly and aesthetically exist in the past is also the film that took him 20 years to make. In his interviews, Bresson speaks of this film as early as in the 50s, but his idea of the film changed significantly over time. He first intended for the film to be in black and white, but of course he shot the final film with color stock. He also previously spoke of shooting an English version of the film, as the King Arthur myth exists in both France and England, and he could probably secure more funding if the character spoke English, and could thus appeal to a larger demographic. Well, Lancelot du Lac, as he made it, is only in French. It's a fever dream of a King Arthur tale, opening up with brutal violence and focusing on the disintegration of the Knights of the Round Table after they failed to find the Holy Grail. The knights factionalize and turn against each other, due in large part to the discovery of Guinevere's illicit affair with Lancelot. Even though he ends the affair near the beginning of the film, bloody conflict ensues. However, Bresson trolls the viewers, keeping most of the fighting off-screen, using ellipses to cut past them. It's a story that turns the mythos on its head. Weirdly enough, Richard Linklater watched the film every day for a week while he was running the Austin Film Society. He and a cinematographer, Lee Daniel, would go on to say that certain shots in Slacker were directly inspired by shots in Lancelot du Lac. Bresson's most depressing work, in my opinion, is Le Diable Probablement, The Devil Probably. Bresson mixes archival news footage into the film, which warns of imminent environmental disaster. Living in this pre-apocalyptic world is a group of anarchistic, nihilistic young adults, with Bresson mostly focusing on Charles. Charles tries to find meaning in the world and in life, until he decides that he instead needs to find meaning in death. The film won the Silver Bear at the Berlinale Film Festival, and was heavily praised by Rainer Werner Fassbinder. That being said, a film that parallels planetary destruction with personal self-destruction does not make for an easy watch. Bresson's final film, L'Argent, won him the coveted prize of Best Director at the 1983 Cannes Film Festival, tying for the prize with the famed Russian auteur Andrei Tarkovsky for his film Nostalgia. L'Argent, yet again based on a Tolstoy story, this time The Counterfeit Bill, tracks a working-class man's descent into crime and evil after a couple schoolkids create a counterfeit note. Much like Balthazar and Mouchette, the protagonist Yvon endures more injustice and hardships than most people can handle. However, unlike Balthazar and Mouchette, the circumstances only serve to corrupt his soul, transforming him into a serial killer. The film leaves us no resolution with its abrupt ending either. Critics asked if Bresson had grown pessimistic or nihilistic, but he insisted that, instead, he gained clarity. If Balthazar was a climax of his black and white films, then L'Argent is the culmination of all of his color films. It is Bresson at the top of his form, and the best representation of his style and philosophy. It's fitting, then, that the last shot in the film should be that of a door. After L'Argent, Bresson tried for many years to create what he thought would be his magnum opus, Genesis. It was to be a cinematic retelling of the book of Genesis. However, he couldn't raise the proper funds for the movie, despite being given money in 1985 for pre-production. More than likely, investors didn't feel comfortable with backing this project, as it would have been larger than anything he made before, and his films hardly ever turned a profit. How should you watch the films? With Bresson, it's quite easy. His films became more and more inaccessible as he aged, so I would recommend starting with Les Anges du Péché and working your way through his filmography chronologically. However, since we are dealing with French movies, I'll play the role of sommelier. Just like how you pair a certain wine with a certain dish, I'll tell you what other film would work best if you want to have a Friday night double feature. Pair Les Anges du Péché with another melodrama about nuns, except this time in Technicolor in English, Black Narcissus. When you watch Les Dames du Bois de Boulogne, you can complement your palette with another cocktail-written script about screwed-up relationships. Les Enfants Terribles. Do a Bernanos double feature. After you watch The Diary of a Country Priest, turn on Maurice Pialat's Palme d'Or winning Under the Son of Satan. If you want World War II and interior monologues, consider watching Le Silence de la Mer shortly after enjoying A Man Escaped. If you're hungry for some more sleight of hand after watching Pickpocket, then pair it with Orson Welles' movie F for Fake. Compare two masters at work and watch The Trial of Joan of Arc and The Passion of Joan of Arc back to back. Once you witness the sins and hardships of the French small town in O Hazard Balthazar, come and witness the sins and hardships of the Texan small town in The Last Picture Show. After seeing the world through the eyes of a suffering French teenage girl in Mouchette, look through the eyes of a suffering Indian teenage boy in A Perejito. It's just as depressing. If you might have thought that 13 Reasons Why and A Gentle Woman would have been a good combo, well then you would have been wrong. Instead, watch Cocteau's film Orpheus, which is based on the Greek myth. It'll serve as a nice contrast to the Bresson classic. Experience Paris at night by making a double feature of Four Nights of a Dreamer and Midnight in Paris. Watch The Holy Grail alongside Lancelot du Lac for a double dose of revisionist mythology. I'm tempted to suggest pairing Melancholia with Le Diable Probablement, but I don't want any of you, my respected viewers, to get too depressed. So instead, I suggest a palate cleanser after watching this film, and for that, I'm going to recommend Makoto Shinkai's 2016 movie, Your Name. If you're feeling like you live in a society, then watch L'Argent and Joker back to back. Just don't blame me for any crimes you may commit afterwards. If you want to wind down on a Friday night and not watch Genesis, as it was never made, then you should do a double feature, and also not watch Kubrick's unproduced epic, Napoleon. And that is the beginner's guide to Robert Bresson. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell. I will see you in the next video.